Hey there, welcome back to another episode of the Offset Podcast. Today we're talking about the wacky and wonderful world of conforming and about a product poised to make all of that much easier. Stay tuned.
Support for this episode comes from Flanders Scientific's XMP 551 and XMP 651, the flagship QD OLED reference monitors that are reshaping modern grading rooms. Their large format and industry-leading viewing angles let clients see accurate images from anywhere in the room, and their true HDR and SDR reference performance makes single monitor room layouts possible. When everyone relies on the same display, you avoid the headache of explaining why the client and grading monitors don't match. Learn more at flandersscientific.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Offset Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Robbie Carmen, and with me, as always, is Joey Dana. Hey Joey, how are you, buddy?
Hey everyone.
Well, Joey, today we decided that we wanted to dig a little deeper on a conversation, on a topic or a conversation that we have talked about before. We've talked about conforms and bakes and the best workflows there, but we recently sort of had this subject come back up to mind, sort of in the forefront, because we welcomed a brand new sponsor to the show, the guys at Conform.tools, and so in checking out their product, we're like, oh, well, what does this tool do? And it just got us to realize, man, Conform is such a deep and sort of technical, sort of artistic process at the same time that is full of a lot of sort of learned institutional knowledge, a lot of mistakes that people make assuming that something works one way or the other way. And if you're not, I always think if you're not really that technical of a person, the Conform process might as well be reading a Charles Poynton book or something like that for the uninitiated. It's a real technical process that can be a little overwhelming. Don't you agree?
Yeah, and for me, I love this stuff because, as most people know at this point, I kind of grew up in the online editing world of first tape to tape and then nonlinear online editing. So Conform has been part of my bread and butter for over 20 years, right? It's always been bring in all the high-res stuff from what was used to be an offline edit, or maybe a proxy edit now, or just these days they might even be editing full res, but getting everything from a Premiere or a Final Cut into a Resolve, or even going Resolve to Resolve for Conform. There's so many infinite different workflow possibilities that come with every single project, and every single project has its own unique challenges depending on what the needs are, how it was edited, how it's being finished. So this is a subject, like you said, there's a lot of technical and institutional knowledge that goes into it. It's I remember that Premiere handles this one timecode issue in this one way because of a project I did 10 years ago. So I've been in the online editing and Conform world for all of my career. So I love this subject. It's something I feel like we've dealt with a lot, and we've solved a lot of problems, but there's always, like I said, every project has its own challenges and is different. So Conform is always a little bit of a brain engineering challenge, and if you look at it that way, it can be fun.
Well, the other way to look at it, for me too, is that to me it's very much a translation issue. It's like a language thing, right? You're speaking one language over here with one tool set and part of the process, and you're translating that over to another tool set and another part of the process. And in translation, as the phrase goes, right, things can be lost in translated, translation, confused in translation. So yeah, and I come from, obviously a similar background where the online days of, okay, fine, we're going to go from whatever AVR 3 to 77, whatever the formats were back then, right? So it has a lot of similar things. But before we get into last little bit of housekeeping before we jump back in, as a reminder, you can always follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for the Offset Podcast. You can, of course, watch the video version of the show over on YouTube. And then the show is also available on all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. All right. So, Joey, I think we could bandy about this subject for a long time, but nobody wants to hear us blab all the time. So we are very lucky today to have two experts join us. These are actually some good friends who have just started a brand new company and just came on board as a sponsor. And those are the guys from Conform Tools. We have Brandon Thomas and we have Stefan Allen. Guys, welcome. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Robbie. Thanks for having us.
Brandon I've known for, gosh, probably going almost on 20 years now.
Been there.
He is the principal, one of the principals down at TBD Post down in Austin, Texas, a major post house in the area, and they do a wide range of work from narrative features and docs to advertising to you name it, they do it. And Stefan is one of the team members down there as well. And guys, I don't want to tell this story for you, so let's back up to the beginning. So obviously, Conform was something it's been on your minds, obviously, from your day-to-day jobs of what you do. Just tell us a little bit about kind of, what Conform means to you, what you saw as some of the challenges, and kind of how the idea for sort of getting started with a product, and we'll dive into the product, obviously, but how the sort of the origins of this started as a sort of an idea.
I mean, I think a big part of it is, when, my background's also like a colorist, and so like
Yep.
a lot of times we want the color session to look as similar to what was an offline and what the final product is going to be as possible. So, and I don't think everybody works this way, but we go through like large pains to make that experience for the client in the room as like close to perfection as possible. And so as things evolve, like it's been really fascinating to kind of watch, like interlacing used to be this thing that you would like spend days on fixing and Terranexing and all that stuff, and now people are like, we like that, it makes it feel like nostalgic, and like it kills me.
Dude, you gotta be careful, because you get Joey going on interlacing.
We did a whole episode on that.
Yeah, but it kills me, but it's like, but it's just like that's kind of how things are evolving, and but it's just like we still want to try and bring things to this like as close to perfect as possible, and how to do that as efficiently as possible, because like there are, I think a lot of what this tool came out of was like a documentary project where they'd spent 3 years doing these really detailed moves on stills and all this stuff that like was really intentional, like detailed work that did not in any way come over from Premiere. And so it's like literally Stefan and spending days like rebuilding all this stuff so that it looks like what had been delivered to us. But I think more than anything, it's just like the attention to detail, it has to be there. And like I think when you're working on a team, it's like we're always like looking, checking each other's work, just have each other's backs. And like, if something got missed here, we're fixing it here. And just, so I think it's just always been this process of how do we streamline this thing to get as close to perfect, as quick in the process as possible to get ahead of those problems later. Cause we're always smashed to the finish line. We do a lot of films that go to festivals, and like, the people are always like just trying to spend every second, like just perfecting the story. And so as much as we can bring ourselves away from finding problems in the last second is just always something that makes life better. But yeah, it's a intensely detail focused thing that just will consume, days of time and just
and it's been my experience too that like one of the, and I'm curious on your thoughts about this, Stefan, because like you, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a sort of online editing flame kind of background as your kind of story, and I think that's interesting, because I think a lot of people who this product is interested, is focused to, that we'll talk about, is the editor or the colorist sort of either prepping or preparing. And I think that it's easy in that conversation to realize that there are people who specialize at this type of work. And I'm curious, like, having done this for years, why is it a specialty? What is it like? Do you find conforming like using a different part of your brain? Are there technical skills that you've amassed over the years that it's just too difficult to explain to somebody else? Like, what draws you to that process, and why did you think that, like, hey, we could improve on this?
Yeah, I mean, Conform is like, there's no handbook that tells you like this is exactly how this is supposed to go, and every program works differently and the translations are different, and it's really, like you said, it's just like a lot of institutional knowledge that you kind of collect over time, and it's very much like this part has to happen before this part has to happen before this part, and if you mess that up, it can really sort of snowball in a way that adds a bunch of time, especially when it comes to like dealing with large media sources and stuff like that. So, and then I think like I realized at some point it's like it's all math at a certain level, and it's like,
Sure,
why doesn't this work? If it's it's like 1 + 1 = 2, so it's like it should in some way work. So there must be something in the format that is making these two programs not talk to each other. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it is creative, and it is, like I find a lot of joy in doing it sometimes, but when it comes to like keyframes that were like purposefully tweaked in offline, which is happening more and more, I feel like people are like really like sweetening this stuff in offline, and then they bring it to online. And like Brandon said, it's like we get into a color session or something, and then all of a sudden they're like, wait a second, why isn't that like speed ramp exactly how I had it? And now they're asking questions about that as opposed to like the color.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's the color equivalent of what monitor I look at, like now that things are like just slightly different, right? It's
Yeah,
like,
and I'm in the room like, no, I promise it's not going to be like this. It's gonna like this is just what it's going to be like in color, and then when it gets to the finish, it's going to be fixed, and it's just like, that's just taking away from the work we're trying to do.
Yeah, and let me mention two quick things. Brandon, you mentioned that as you're going through this process in kind of the conventional way without any additional tools to help you, let's just call it the fully manual way, right? One of the biggest problems, one of the biggest challenges is finding, identifying, and fixing not mistakes, but let's say inconsistencies or errors. Because, if you've got an hour-long show with 2,000 shots in it, and one person is going through every single shot, checking it against reference, maybe using a difference blending mode, and you get into this mindset where, okay, well, the difference blending mode can have, X amount of offness to it because we're going from low res to high res media, for example. So there's a threshold, and that's a judgment call. And you're going through and you kind of calibrate your brain to check these sequences, and you get into autopilot, and we're humans, right? We're not robots. Every time you go through this conform process, even the best of us that have been doing this for 20 years and have tuned our brain to try to find single pixel errors, almost
something out,
like one pixel in one frame, something always falls through. That's why you need to do multiple passes. That's why it's important to have multiple people on the team look at these things and flag things. I feel like that's one of the situations where automation and customized tools are really stronger than any artist can be, because the likelihood of them, shot, next shot, next shot, next shot, I missed something, right?
Yeah, I mean,
that goes down the drain.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have an incredible team, but we're thrown a million different directions all the time. It's like we're really fortunate that we're working on a movie or two in a commercial campaign, and then there's a documentary coming through, and they need a DCP, and so like our team is just like constantly kind of jumping to this project and that project, and like everyone's doing an awesome job, but it's like it's first frame, last frame, check it, difference mode, and all that stuff, and it's just like, and then okay, cool, there's revisions and there's stuff coming through, and so it's just like there's all that stuff flying around all the time. And it's like, yeah, we're human, we're gonna miss something. And that's kind of like, I think that team dynamic of like everyone's got each other's back, of just like we're all kind of in this together to kind of catch stuff where we can along the way.
And that's important to
like
build into the workflow, the assumption that you can keep anybody can keep their eye out for a mistake and flag it, because these workflows are so complicated that it's possible for errors to get introduced at any step in the process.
Well, I think the other interesting part, especially coming from a facility background, and we've mentioned the idea of institutional knowledge a couple times, right? Is that the just the ebb and flow of people in and out of a facility, right? So like somebody gets good at this, they're with you guys for a year or two, and then they whatever, they move on to other things, they leave the company or whatever, and now it's like, oh, how did they do that? Like, what were the 5 steps that they did? And I think that Joey's right onto a certain thing, that like automation and sort of algorithmically sort of programming this part of things to a certain degree, right? Like lessens that potential loss of institutional knowledge when the next thing happens. But also it strikes me that, and we'll talk about this just in the next thing I want to talk about, is all the various pieces that could go wrong. It strikes me that if this is sort of programmed and done algorithmically, that you have a base that you can continue to add to as new features develop, new workflows develop, Premiere changed this or Resolve changed that, right? And you can make those tweaks and get that kind of programmed in for everybody, rather than going, hey, I figured this out, don't tell anybody, this is the secret sauce kind of thing to get. So I think that's a big thing. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the core challenges here. Again, I want to sort of give you my version of what Conform is and see if I'm right, because you guys are spending a lot of time in this, right? Okay, so here's the situation. Somebody's edited a film. Let's just call it a narrative feature, okay? They've edited a film, and let's say they've used Premiere Pro, right? And they've brought in, let's say they've, two really, really lot of shooting. So they've done proxy workflow for everything. They got this timeline that's all proxied, and then they did things like speed changes, some temp color correction, etc. And now they got to go, okay, well, I got to flip those proxies, flatten my multicams, look at my speed changes, adjust my sizing. I was thinking about this last night. There's like 10 things. Let me see if you get these jive with what you have. So time code and file naming, big one, right? Reels, things of that nature. Things like the offline online workflow can screw you up if you don't realize that you're in it. Things like sizing and speed changes, probably the biggest pain in the asses especially from Premiere Pro. And I want to ask you guys why that is in just a moment. Things like VFX concerns, like where am I going to pull these shots? How am I going to automate that process? Things like trim and transfer. Okay. So we've got this all correct. Now, how do we package it up and move it over to the other place? What do they need on their end, right? There's probably about 10 other more things that I can add to that, but it's like broad categories. Does that kind of fit? Or where else do you guys see some of the major pain points? Stefan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think like in and out points of the clips, that's like the first thing. If you don't have a clip that can link, or it's linking to the wrong time code or something, that's a huge problem. And then on top of that is sizing. And then the things that are more complicated, like speed ramps and easing of keyframes and things like that, traditionally hasn't been something that carries across in a conform. So that's like where we're doing a lot of work to kind of make it look correct. But yeah, I think what you said is more or less like the layers upon layers of what you deal with in a conform.
So let's start with sizing and positioning, because I think that's going to be on the forefront of everybody's mind, because the most common workflow that we run into, and I think this is the same for most of the people that listen to the show, obviously there's a million different workflows, but the one we see the most and we have the most problems with is going from Premiere to Resolve, having sizing issues. And there's a couple components to that, right? There is the, how do you deal with sizing in Premiere, as in if in Premiere you're editing in a 1080 timeline and you have 4K sources, then we go into Resolve for a 4K finish with those 4K sources from their 1080 timeline. How does the scaling map? Now in Resolve, we have this luxury of basically all access information is stored internally kind of relatively. So if we go from a 720 canvas to an 8K canvas, all of our sizing stays the same. All of our windows stays the same. All of our geometry stays the same. Not the case with Premiere. So explain to us a little bit on the broadest possible scale. We don't need to get into like the super details. Why is the way Premiere handles axes and sizing so, I hesitate to say idiotic and wrong, but why is it so idiotic and wrong? And then how do we map that to a world of reality?
Can I add two more before you answer? Let me add two or three more sprinkles on top of that, right? I think Joey sort of went quickly over the way that you handle it in Premiere Pro, because I think that's a big deal, right? There's the set and scale to frame size options. There's the manual adjust X and Y and changing, and it's always, and I don't know if this is correct. I've been spouting this for years, so if it's BS, I apologize to anybody I told it to. But it seems to me that the Premiere Pro coordinate system is, how should I say this? It's built on like, I don't know, there's something about it's built on like source media, not like canvas, like the canvas size, like not like the timeline size.
I think you're backwards, right? It's built on the canvas size, not the source size. I don't know.
These guys will tell us. Anyway, let's start there, guys. Why is this such a cluster, and what can be done to fix it?
Well, I think it's a cluster because they don't intend you to leave the system. I think that's the truth about a lot of these companies, is that they want you to stay in their ecosystem as long as possible. They want you to do everything there. They want you to do everything in Premiere. They want you to do everything in Resolve. They want you to do everything in Avid, And I think that's where this comes from. And then I think the supporting these export formats like, XML or, OTIO, it's like they're kind of like, they're often very like half-hearted attempts, because they're like,
please the community kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like, hey, we're going to support this, but we're not really going to fully commit to it in a way that's actually going to make it solve the problem.
Well, like the open open timeline IO one is a perfect example. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a, I should say, hopeful standard of the idea that we can unify a lot of these kind of settings into one universal timeline format that a lot of people have said, yeah, like, I mean, even Resolve supports it now, right? But as you said, Brandon, like, do they really support it, or is it just something they put a menu item in, and it's kind of like, I'm not saying that they haven't done the work. I'm just saying your sentiment about kind of the half-hearted approach definitely rings true.
I mean, I think there's like, this is what it is. And so, I think they're checking the boxes of it does this thing to go into an OTIO, but it doesn't necessarily, like, everyone's doing it differently though. So like the results you get coming from Premiere or Avid, or, they're all going to kind of give you a different thing. And I think for certain workflows, like especially like VFX polls, like that might be exactly what you need, because you're really getting the like the clip information of like your in and outs and your real names and all that stuff. And like, I think any platform is going to support that. But then when it starts getting into like the speed and the sizing and all that stuff, it really starts to kind of fall short for now. And hopefully that'll continue to improve.
Support for this episode comes from Conform Tools. Conform Tools allows you to translate timelines between Premiere and Resolve and other NLEs while automatically solving common issues that normally need to be fixed by hand. Avoid time-consuming trim and transfer issues and securely send large media files to collaborators at a fraction of the size and in minutes instead of hours. With a growing toolbox of features, let Conform Tools handle the tedious stuff so you can focus on the creative. Built by post professionals, Conform Tools helps editors, colorists, and conform artists move faster and finish stronger. Learn more at conform.tools.
I don't know if it's so much that it's like half-hearted as it is that like they are following the spec according to what OTIO wrote or XML Apple wrote back in the day. It's just that like both specs can be correct, but they don't talk to each other because they have coordinate systems and all that, which is to your question earlier about why everything is such a cluster in Premiere, which is true. Yeah, I think like in Premiere, everything is based on, it's not resolution agnostic is the way I like to phrase it. And also Resolve isn't either if you have certain settings set. So it's like, if you have your input scaling set to scale to fit, entire image to fit, then you're in this like frame agnostic form. So you can go from HD to UHD and back. Premiere doesn't really have that option. It's just like sort of locked to whatever resolution you made your timeline in. So that's where a lot of that pain comes from, because a lot of times it's like you're cutting in HD because that's easy and that's what you do in offline, and then all of a sudden you have to deliver in UHD in Resolve, and if you just pull that XML in, it's like all the sizing is based off of HD, and it might look fine in HD, but then you go to UHD and all the sizing is screwed up. And then
and there's lots of hacks to that. Like we found, what's the one we found, like the center crop or whatever. Like there's different modes that you could put Resolve in to kind of sort of get it to work, but then there's always those couple outliers, right, that just don't, no matter what, because they were a weird aspect ratio or whatever, they don't do their thing.
There's a lot of hacks of like input sizing, output sizing. Like there's different ways to kind of trick it. Like when adjustment layers got added to Resolve, there was a period where we were trying to mess with adjustment layer sizing for a hot minute. It didn't stick, don't worry, but it was just like one of those, like, what can we do to solve this? And like anamorphic footage was a whole other can of worms. And
all right, so sizing is obviously a big issue. One of the ones that your tool set we're going to talk about in a little bit will attack. How the next one is speed changes. I think that's another one that can drive people a little bonkers. And I will admit to something, that a lot of the content that we do doesn't have very complicated speed changes, right? It's like a fit to fill, or it's like a standard frame rate kind of conversion of 25 to 2398 or whatever, like relatively static, straightforward stuff. I think that stuff has relatively worked for a while, most of the time.
Yeah.
But what about, like, I find people like, who have eagle eyes about variable speed changes and ramps, and they're like, see how that, like, that's a little different here and a little different there. Like, why is that infinitely more complicated from a translation point of view? And like, what's the right way? Like, is it just, again, case of different math in different places, or is there one side just sort of doing it the right way, one side doing it the improper way or whatever?
It's not that they're doing it like the improper way. Well, there's a few things that like I think Adobe never bothered to fix about their export XML thing. There's like
Yeah.
these bugs that I've found when trying to build these tools that even if you bring it back into Premiere, it doesn't look
doesn't
right.
work. Right.
Like
And part of that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when you export an XML from Premiere, you're exporting a Final Cut 7 format XML, right? Even the
OG.
format it's going to is very legacy.
Yeah. And that's like it's a pretty powerful format. I don't personally understand why they like made so many other ones, but it can store a lot of information. That's not really the problem. It's just like, for example, like the first thing that was driving me nuts was we would get these projects from Premiere and I'd get them to be matching and I'm like, okay, so these clips are matching in Resolve. That means like my translation is correct. And then all of a sudden we'd get to a clip and it would be like tiny square. And so I'm like, what the heck is happening here? And it was because they set the scale to frame size thing. So then I'm like Googling and finding forums and people are like, oh yeah, this is a thing. That's always been a thing. And it's like,
Yeah.
And then that goes to the institutional knowledge thing. But the scale to frame size doesn't get recorded in an XML anywhere. So it's like if you set that in Premiere, that
And
information.
similar with your, with the subject of speed changes, one of the big issues that we've always had is when editors in Premiere take different frame rates and tell Premiere to interpret it as a different frame rate. I have a 60p clip. I want to tell it to overcrank at 2398. And there's no way for the XML to have that information. So Resolve is expecting a completely different timecode system.
Yeah.
And obviously that's not going to work.
Yeah. That is, you kind of have to know what clips have been reinterpreted before you even import the XML. And then you have the best chance of getting them to link in because you can pull the media in, reinterpret it, then pull the XML in, and, then hopefully it will link up. But that's like, how are you supposed to know that?
And I feel like, that's kind of a overall conceptual thing on starting on the edit side is, should you even do that? Or should you know that this is a 60 frame a second clip? So I need to, if I want it to be overcranked, like you said, it all comes back down to math. So that you could do that overcrank with a speed effect in the timeline without changing the source side. If you do the ratio of, I don't know the math. I think it's 1/5 or is it 1/5 or whatever the ratio.
I'll go with that.
If you do that speed effect and set it to a linear interpolation, you will get a frame for frame overcrank from those source clips without having to go through this whole process. But I don't think a lot of people, one, know that, or two, want to go through that whole process.
Yeah. We're kind of the mindset, I think, that like the people on the edits, we don't have control over that. And people are just like, Premiere lets you do whatever you want. It's like, and people are going to do whatever they want. So we're less about, like, hey, if you reinterpret, like make sure, you do the speed change instead. It's like, okay, well, for me, it's like, if it's showing up correctly in Premiere,
it should
gotta be a way to
correctly somewhere else.
We just have to figure out why and then get it to do the same thing.
And that makes a lot of sense because it helps, it lets the creative people, focus on the creative edit and then let the technical people and the technical software handle the technical side.
It does obviously help if someone is like tidy in their edit, but like, can't be asking for too much.
So the other speed related thing that I think we see often is the idea that somebody has frame rate not the extreme example that Joey gave, like the 60 to 23, but hey, I have stock footage that's 2997 and I dropped it in 2398 timeline or 25 or whatever, right? And Premiere Pro does its default frame interpolation, right? To get that math to work. Is dealing with, because I think a lot of editors these days are hip to, or at least sensitive enough these days to like things like repeated frames and that problem, right? Because a lot of them are delivering to digital platforms that those repeated frames get, flagged in QC and whatnot. Is that part of translation with speed also a challenging, problematic thing to solve, right? Like, because I feel like a lot of editors are like, oh, well, I'll make this look better by just changing it over to optical flow and not realizing that optical flow is, inventing frames and, that kind of stuff. Are those different interpolation modes, in other words, a problem in this process as well?
I think we've pretty much solved those. Yeah, I mean, they are a problem. They're also like a creative problem. I think when you have like a 25 clip in a 2398 timeline,
Right.
and then all of a sudden that edit has been locked, but now the 25 is doing a weird cadence, and you're like,
Yep.
if I just sped this to whatever 96% or whatever that is, we wouldn't have that weirdness. And like, is that okay? Do I have to get that approved, or like, how do I sort of fix those issues? But as far as like the translation goes, that is less of I mean, like with our tools, of course, but and I think with the XML as well, that's less of a headache than like the speed ramp, which can
Gotcha.
be really a pain.
So one more, we talked about speed changes, we talked about sizing, we talked about some of this time code stuff. I want to talk about the worst case scenario because, like, okay, I don't know if this is a pipe dream, but one of the things that comes to, in any conform, even if you get it relatively automated or whatever, is there's still going to be those judgment calls. There's still going to be the situation where you're, taking, an offline reference and doing a difference mode and trying to line things up. One of the things that's always, and I don't know if this is like me just being wishful thinking about it, but it's always just seemed like relatively low hanging fruit. And again, that's some simpleton's way of explaining it is, why can't I just look at an offline version of a reference file and go, hey, computer, I paid $10,000 for you. You're smart. Why can't you look at this? Here's a folder of media and just figure out how to put it together. Am I wrong? Does that seem like something that we should be striving to and that we should be able to get to at one point in time?
I think we're, you know, the answer is like we want that too, like so
Right,
we're
right.
we're actually like testing something that it's trying to work towards that. And there are things out there that do that, but they're not accessible to small facilities and individuals. It's a lot of computing power to like go through and analyze that stuff. So we're I think as these GPUs get better and all that stuff, it's like we're experimenting with some stuff like that
Yeah.
I think can help with that. I was doing a car commercial recently, and it was all rips from these previous like existing spots, and there was no original file names or anything like that, and like it was about 2.5 3 hours to rebuild a 30-second spot, by just like everything by hand, and
Yeah. Yeah.
even though like we had the XMLs and everything, is just like there was no real metadata to work with. So I think in that situation, I don't think that'd be too a crazy amount of compute. It's just you've got to build that system out in a way that can do that. But yeah, that's definitely something we're exploring on as well. Just like, can we solve that?
But again,
Yeah,
like,
just because I mean, it just seems like a low hanging. It just seems like that's the ultimate fix. Is just I don't know, I don't have time for this. You do it, computer, kind of thing.
It's in this bin. Go find it.
Right, right, exactly.
So now that we've kind of figured out, what the main problems we need to solve are, up until now, the process for doing this has been kind of a little bit of guess and check, a little bit of try this set of options on the export, try this set of options on the import, and see how close it gets me, and then tweak.
Or if it all goes to hell, just bake. If it goes, just take my attitude. Just if it all goes to hell, just bake it down and call it a day.
Yeah, or bake these sections and go through all this manually.
Robbie
Let's
Bake
talk
Carmen.
about Conform Tools. What are you guys doing on the actual product side that helps us solve some of these problems?
Yeah, what is the product? I mean, like, I think that's one of the things that, like, so we've identified the problems. What is the product, and what is it hoping to solve? Maybe you can walk us through kind of like, we've identified a lot of these problems. Where do you guys step in, and where do you think your approach is unique and different and worth sort of the attention of people doing this work?
well, we have a few things that we've been working on. The first thing that we sort of touched on a bit is our tool for timeline exchange, which is built. The first problem I guess we were trying to solve is how do we take a project from Premiere into Resolve, make it work if we go up to UHD, make it so that we don't have to touch every clip and fix all the sizing and all that stuff. And from there, we had the same issue going to Flame. We had the same issue going from Premiere back to, or Resolve back to Premiere. So it's like all these translations aren't working the way that you would hope. And so we've sort of solved that problem so that if you have something set in Resolve, you have a project in Premiere, you can export and bring it into Resolve, and it is going to look like what it looked like in Premiere. So that's sort of one of our products. Another one is we're trying to solve the media aspect of this as well, which we haven't really talked that much about. But like when you're conforming a project with original camera files, it's like we're talking about like terabytes of media.
Yeah.
It's a ton of stuff. Like these are huge files these days, and a lot of times like you don't need the whole captured set of media. You just need some files, and it's just kind of like in a similar way, it's like every program has its own way of doing this. Every shop has its own way of doing this. There's a lot of institutional knowledge around how you should deal with that, but nevertheless people still ship drives or bake it, and it's like that works. Here at TBD we're very like, I guess, like sort of purist about that. We don't
anti-bake. Yeah, I got it.
We're anti-bake, yeah. But
I mean, from my seat as a colorist in the chair, like having that source media, it gives me so much information that's like so valuable.
Absolutely.
Like real names, time codes, all that stuff. Like when I have that, like I'll use like a lot of smart filters and stuff like that, and it's like I can grade my first pass so quickly because I can just do this really intelligent grouping and sorting and like run with that stuff. And
I have to be honest with you guys, I've come around a little bit on this. I think my tendency to go to the bake has often been one of hassle and budget, right? That like
totally
you're not going to pay me for the three days to sift through your pile of crap, so why don't we just do it the easy way, right? But the more that I've gotten sophisticated, or not even the more sophisticated, just sort of force myself to use some of the more, advanced, smart filtering, sorting, whatever, like you do realize, oh crap, this is the stuff that makes me faster. And like there's hacks and ways around it with, with bakes and EDLs and stuff like that, but they're hacky, right? So I will give you that it's the, if time and budget allows, and now with your guys' tool setting in, hopefully it will streamline some of that time, that it is an advantageous thing to get a truly conformed project.
I mean, I think really what we're after is like reducing friction, so like if you can take a project from Premiere to Resolve and the conform is like perfect or nearly perfect, you might have just saved on a feature film a couple days,
yeah,
or
right.
a few
That's real money. That's
real money, and it's real time. And then and the colorist seat, it's like then I have all the visibility I want. And then I think it's that same thing for the transfer tool I2O. It's like especially for short form stuff, you're sending commercials. It's like you can send just that little chunk. Like I can't tell you, like we have our production coordinator on a mission to return hard drives for like weeks now of just like
God, I got
our
piles.
Like I think we're down to like 40 drives in house now, and we had like 200. It's just like it's just been this process of like it's just way more efficient to kind of handle these things, and it's kind of the antithesis of like don't send everything, just like spend the smallest amount possible.
So Stefan, you've outlined sort of I think the first two modules of what conform tools are, right? So the timeline exchange, kind of fixing all the crap, right? The speed changes, the sizing, etc. You've done that with timeline exchange. Now it's time to come transfer it. So we have I2O, the transfer module, right? That allows us to sort of intelligently kind of bundle that up, media manage it, trim it for transfer. Does I2O also facilitate the actual transfer, or is it just the, hey, I'm going to make a folder of stuff, now it's up to you to move it?
Yeah, it does. And I will mention that these are all things that were like these are all new tools, and we're building them out, and we're really excited about it. But they're changing in real time and getting better and better. But for our I2O, it's like for all ways that you might need to get media to someone, whether that's like uploading it or just like packaging it in a way so you can put it on your own Google Drive or Dropbox or whatever. And also like if you want to do sort of a live session to get the media over, we have solutions for all of that. And the whole idea behind it is that you're only capturing, I guess, on the receiving end, the literal bytes of media that you need. So it's like trimming without having to actually change the essence of the files. And I can talk a little bit more about how that actually works on the technical side, but that's the
I'm actually really like, I've never heard of something that can trim without trimming. Like how does that work?
I think one of the coolest things about it is like, you don't have to like consolidate media in Premiere that can't maintain your raw footage. You don't have to transcode that stuff. And so there's already a time savings there. But yeah, this is like basically it appears as it's the original source file on the other side without having to send the entire piece of media.
So without giving away any proprietary information, if I had to guess here, what you're saying is that it's able to sort of intelligently go, this is the frame that I want to start on, this is the frame I want to end on, and close the file at either end, so it's a complete thing, right? But getting rid of superfluous information. Is that kind of the general idea?
It's not getting rid of it. It's just saying, like, this is never going to be scrubbed in the timeline because you're importing all this footage there. So it's like, this can all just be, as far as the computer is aware, zero information. So as the metadata about the size of the file, the length of the file, how many frames it's supposed to have, all that stuff stays the same. But the actual information that you need is what gets transferred over.
So that's actually a really interesting and I'd say innovative and new approach that nobody's really attempted before, right? Because even though, Premiere can do obviously the transcode thing, which we don't really want to do, but Resolve can do pretty advanced trimming of raw files where it gives you a new file with a new in and out. But that doesn't really solve this problem for some workflows because you have to have the original file here. And
Right.
We're talking about getting the project from the editor to the colorist. So what you're saying is when you go through the process of the I2O transfer, it's going to give, say, for example, Resolve at the destination end, an R3D file that its metadata says it's an hour long, right? But everything is zeroed out except for the section that you're actually going to be using in the conform. So you'd be able to, in Resolve, scrub through an hour of black that is not taking any data up on the drive.
I see. Okay, so let me.
That is new and innovative in a way that I don't think anybody else has ever attempted, let alone make work. And I think it's really freaking smart. If you're heading to NAB 2026 in Las Vegas, stop by booth N1827 and see FSI's latest reference monitors up close. The team will be there all week talking color, calibration, and monitoring workflows for production, post, and broadcast.
Let's just play arbitrary numbers. Let's just say that file is, I don't know, 20 gigs on my source hard drive, my original location hard drive, and I'm using 10 seconds of it. So let's use another number. Let's say that gets it down to 2 gigs from 20, right? You're saying that I'm only transferring the 2 gigs, but from a metadata perspective, reconnect perspective, it looks to the computer as just as the original 20 gig file, same in and out, same data, but everything that's not that content is just blankness. It's a void.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
that's
cool.
genius.
So that is pretty cool. Are there any issues? Because I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, the timeline exchange part would clean up things first, right? To then because like there's no danger of, oh well, I did this trim, but now I've done a variable speed change on it, and now I'm trying to bring in frames from the voided part. Like that doesn't really happen in practice because we're doing the timeline exchange part first. Is that?
Yeah, it's using the same tools that we've developed for timeline exchange to sort of parse the in and out information. So and then the other thing is, like, once you have that file that has the ranges that you need, and it can also be like if something shows up 3 times on a timeline, you can take just those 3 parts. You don't have to make 3 different trims. Everything else.
That's why this is really innovative, because in the conventional, even the best trim workflow, now you've got 3 files, right? For those 3 sections. And that's a new translation problem. Whereas in this kind of new concept of zeroing out the unused sections of the file, Resolve just sees 1 file. Those 3 areas are intact. Nothing else is wasting space.
Right. It's like you turned off the media offline flag, right? It's like we're just going to show you black instead of the media offline frame. I like that.
Because black doesn't take any space.
Right, black doesn't take any space. All right, so that's pretty darn cool. I got to be honest with you. I didn't know that was exactly how that worked, and that's pretty hip. So we've prepped the timeline exchange. We've sort of media managed, for lack of a better term, trimmed with ITO. Now ITO is also going to allow us to facilitate the actual send, right? So we can just say, hey, this is going to, and what happens on that end? They receive just a download link. They receive a zip. Like what does the other side look like?
Yeah, they receive downloaded files, and you can do all this in the browser. That was the other thing I was going to say is like this isn't using compute really, because you're not trimming in the.
So yeah, it's just figuring out the math and where the ones and zeros are, right? Yeah.
It's working sort of like below the codec level at the byte level, so you can do all of this. Just imagine it's like, you only want to upload this part of the file, but then that file still sort of works as if it was the original, and then you're only downloading the file at that smaller disk usage size, and so the transfer becomes 2 gigs instead of 100 gigs or whatever, and the download becomes that as well. So it saves a bunch of time, it saves a bunch of storage. And the way this works currently is like, if you have an XML, you just pull that into our browser tool, it parses those in and outs, and then it just starts uploading those files, and then that becomes a package. You say who you want to send that to, and they can just download it from there.
So I'm pretty stoked about this. In some ways, no offense, in some ways more than the timeline fixes, because this solves like a really big problem. And I'm guessing this is sort of differentiated by like the plan you're on, right? So like you guys have like your indie, we'll talk about this before we wrap, but sort of your indie professional studio plan. So like I get different bandwidth allocations depending on which sort of plan I'm on. Yeah.
Yeah, so each different plan comes with like a different amount of data that you can send, and then there's like a small overage. If you go over, so it's like you're not limited from not sending more. It's not going to just
stop. You'll just get a little additional. So I got you.
Yeah, that's the plan right now.
All right, so we got timeline exchange, ITO transfer, then sort of the third module, I guess, or third part of this, the conform connect. Explain that bit. Is like, so you have this sort of or it's coming, I guess, sort of this desktop tool that sort of connects all these things together.
Yeah, so we're getting really close to getting that out into the world. So basically, it's kind of like it's providing this hub where you can use timeline exchange and I2O through this desktop app, and then it has this other section that we're calling Conform Connect that basically is directly connecting to Resolve and just giving really powerful tools inside this app. And sometimes we have like little floating windows, so you can have just like a little tiny thing over your interface to do specific things. I think one of the things we're most excited about is we're calling like Edit Index Plus. I don't know how many times we've wanted to be able to like flag a clip from the edit index or just use that as a more powerful tool. So we kind of built that where it can just do crazy searches and filtering, and then you can just do batch operations on all of these clips that you select. So I think it's like super useful for Conform, for grade management, VFX pulls and stuff like that. It's just a really powerful tool set that like we keep adding stuff to as we're like, oh, it'd be cool if it could do this. Now it can do that. And so it basically will kind of update live with whatever's in your timeline. And then, there's a lot of like useful conform tools in there as well, of like, I need a sequence with handles for VFX pulls, or this is like, we've been having some of our workflows involve a lot of magic masks, and they're going to flame, and like we only want one copy of media, even though we have a 90, a 60, a 30, 15 sixes, 10 sixes, like 10 fives. And so we'll create this like all clips timeline, kind of like that you remember like the master timeline,
like the master timeline,
like,
except a lot smarter.
Love the master
timeline. I can't find that anymore. It's like I know there's a way to re-enable it, but I can't find it. But this,
and you might not want it enabled for all your projects, right? Or for the whole project. You might want to just do it for this transfer.
So we basically built this thing, and it'll kick out this timeline that's just the clips of the in and outs with handles if you want them, and then it'll kick it out at like this is your 8K resolution clips, your 6K, your 4K, and it'll kind of create all that stuff to kind of help with some of these round trip problems that we've had of going, because sometimes we'll do color and it gets online somewhere else, or like it's going to Flame or it's going to Premiere or whatever. So it's just a whole slew of tools to kind of help with that. Another one we have in there that we're excited about is like kind of an image alignment tool. So it's like, here's your reference and here's your clip. If timeline exchange didn't nail it, then it's like, here's a thing to kind of help you get it into place quickly. It can't do keyframes yet because of limitations in Resolve, but we're working on trying to like find our way around that stuff. Those are some of the big ones. I'm sure there's a couple others in there too, but it's a really, there's like a great marker utility with a bunch of tools, but it's a really helpful companion of just like, these are things that like will save real time. And so it's
and
like,
that's the stuff I love. I looked when I first saw the Conform Connect like feature list, I'm like, oh, I wrote a half-assed script to do something just like that, but it only really works on my machine and it only works at 1 frame rate. And I didn't go through the process of really actually turning it into something reusable. I just used it to solve one project's problem.
Yeah.
This is going to save time for all projects.
Well, yeah, and I think it's coming from like these are problems we've faced time and time again, and like this is stuff. It's like how do we solve this stuff? Because it's like the more time we can solve with these tools, it's like then we can go and do the creative parts to Conform.
I think that's a really, really kind of a big important distinction for our audience to understand and for your market to understand is that like you have professional software developers who make tools because hey we can make a buck doing software, but they're not necessarily boots on the ground operators sitting behind the desk every day. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm sort of really attracted to this product, because I know how hard you guys work and I know the efforts that you take running a facility and the projects that go through there. And it's like, no, these are real world, like in some ways you understand the problems better than a developer could really ever understand the problems, because it's all just conceptual to the guy doing the programming, right? I mean, no offense, Stefan, but like it's having like the experience, these things, you're like, oh no, the math is doing this one thing but it really works this way, and that experience is invaluable, right? You can't replace that with just another argument in the code kind of thing. So that's cool. Let me ask you this. So right now, Timeline Exchange, I2O transfer, you have the ability to do on the web now. Conform Connect will have a desktop version soon, but there's no like real, I don't know, have like a better term, like super processing going on yet with the tool, right? We're not like having to whatever scale up with new GPUs or whatever. Like that kind of stuff might be later down the road, but like right now it's all more just sort of math-based translation. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Timeline Exchange and I2O stuff is like it's like it's super efficient at this point. Like we've
Oh, and I'm sure it's very. I didn't mean to make it seem like it's simple.
No,
I'm sure it's very sophisticated.
no.
I'm just saying.
But like the first versions of it, like before like Stefan optimized it, like it would take more time to process the translation than it would to do it by hand. But that was just like that's part of that learning, like the programming and optimization and finding where there's these recursions and things like that. And so now it's like working really, really efficiently. I think that's kind of where the desktop app comes in, because like there are things that we're looking to do with kind of like that kind of like image recognition and kind of reconforming kind of stuff, that's like that desktop app will give access to real processing power on your machine to do some of that stuff. Because I think, there's some stuff that like pushing all that media up to the cloud to do that is totally possible, but it's just like, that's just so much time and cost and all that stuff. So we're going to try and leverage that stuff, but like for the tools right now, they don't really need much, so it's like that desktop app is kind of preparing for that, of what that stuff that's going to come that will need that. But a lot of what we're doing probably isn't going to have the craziest lift that's going to make you go buy a Blackwell 6000.
Right. Yeah. Right. I got you.
Yeah.
I got you. So you get these tools out into the wild and people start using them. Where do you see, I mean, you mentioned a couple of them, some of the image recognition stuff or whatever. I'm guessing like this is one of those things where the game now that you got sort of the core build, it's going to be where are the edge cases, right? And getting feedback from users about sort of their workflows and where things could, potentially break down a little bit, that kind of stuff. Because I think that's we talk a lot on this show about proper software testing, how to give proper feedback. If you could, people who are listening to this and want to give it a shot, what would you tell them in terms of, hey, this is the kind of feedback that really helps us improve the tool? Because I think a lot of people just go, oh, well, make it just like this, and never really think about the further implications of that. So what kind of feedback is most helpful for you guys at this stage of the game?
Detail. I think for we've got like a little private beta going for the app, and like there's a form that we're like sending out to people that's just like it's super detailed of just like trying to capture as much data as possible, like including like screenshots or screen captures where possible. Yeah. And I think like that's on the app, but that's probably a little more intense on the kind of Timeline Exchange and I2O part. It's like if you can send us your project file, if you're allowed to, that really helps us understand what might have happened. And because basically we're not seeing people's media in Timeline Exchange or I2O. It's like it's all just this information that's being parsed. So we don't we don't really have a lot of visibility into that stuff. So it's like we need people to be able to provide that to us so we can help solve those problems. And we fortunately have a lot of stuff come through the shop, so we've determined a lot of like edge cases already. But everyone has a unique workflow and process, and everyone does things in their own way. So the more that we can learn, and like we're getting some feedback now of like some issues that we're like solving, and so it's just if we don't know about it, we can't solve it. So it's
Yeah, of course.
just yeah. Hopefully, people are just reaching out when they have an issue, and we can solve it pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to me, guys, that you put this through the paces enough where you're using it in your day-to-day workflows, which I think says a lot about sort of the power of the tool. Because I mean, like a lot of people like come up with tools and like, how are you using this? No, we're using a modified in-house version. Like you guys are using this version to get your daily workflow done, and I think that says a lot about the power of the tool. So tell us about where people can find information about Conform tools, where the best place to follow. I know there's obviously the website at conform.tools. You have a Discord server. You guys are going to be at NAB as well. Tell us a little bit about the next month or so, where people can go to find more out about this, where they can find you at NAB, etc.
Yeah, I think right now we're really kind of just starting our kind of like marketing efforts, and we're post folks, so it's like marketing's kind of a new thing for us. But we're yeah, but yeah, we're really excited about NAB. We're gonna sponsor the Colorist Mixer, and we're gonna kind of give away a couple like year-long subscriptions there as kind of like one of the raffle prizes. And then we're gonna be on the show floor. We're probably gonna be hanging around the FSI booth. I think we're on Instagram and stuff like that. But like we're gonna be around. So Stefan and I and Ted, our other partner, is gonna be kind of just out there on the floor, just kind of answering questions and trying to spread the word.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, so I would do everybody go right now, go over to conform.tools and check out the offerings there. You can check out pricing and the different subscription tiers, check out Timeline Exchange and I2O Transfer. I mean, I have to say that I think a lot of people have dabbled in this space, but have given up for the complexity. And so I think it's cool that you guys have kind of stuck with it a little bit too, because I'm sure in the development process, some of these challenges were like at times you want to just put your head through a wall, right? Because it's like, it's not really well documented. You sort of have to trial and error, figure this out. Like it's had to have been a process to get to this point, I'm guessing.
Yeah. And I think for us, it's like, this is a space that there's a lot of time spent doing it, or people are using other ways to sort of get around the problem. And it's like, we have these tools already, but we just feel like this whole Conform area is like, traditionally, like people have the XML and then they're like, oh, we need a better one. And then they made this other one. And then they're like, you know what, let's make a third one. And then they keep making them. But it's like the programs don't really care about making them talk to each other. So we feel like it's a place where we can really help out, especially with the things that we figured out.
Very cool, guys. Well, hey man, thanks so much for joining us. I'm stoked to really, like, I've been dabbling, but I'm really like, after this conversation, I'm pretty energized to be like, oh yeah, we gotta get into this more. So be sure to head over to conform.tools, where you can check out the different modules here: Timeline Exchange, I2O Transfer. Obviously check out pricing. You can follow the guys on their Instagram. There's also a good Discord community if you get into testing the tool out. I know I've been flipping through the Discord, learning a little bit about the tool, where people are having some feature requests, that kind of stuff. It's a great community to be a part of. And I think that, if you're at NAB this year, definitely go hang out and catch up with these guys. Like I said, they'll be at the Colorist Mixer. They're sponsoring that. They'll be at the FSI booth occasionally, and I'm sure just walking around the floor. So if you do see either one of these guys, please stop them, give them a high five for creating such an awesome tool. And I'm sure they would both love to talk about how Conform tools can help you on your next project. So guys, thanks so much for joining us. We're really stoked to not only have you on board as a sponsor, but I think just the community is better off for smart dudes like you thinking about stuff like this and putting out a tool. So very appreciative on that front too.
Yeah, thank you guys. This has been awesome.
So, as just a reminder for the rest of our audience here, if you can always follow the Offset Podcast on Instagram or Facebook, you can head over to offsetpodcast.com where you can see our complete library of shows. We are above 50 episodes now. I think this is episode 52 or 53. So it's a growing library of stuff talking about all sorts of subjects. And we would really appreciate it if you'd consider heading over to this link on screen right here to buy us a cup of coffee. Every dollar donated there goes to support the show, help us pay our editor, overhead costs, etc. So anything you can do, we really appreciate that. And of course, over at the offsetpodcast.com, there is a ideas button at the top of the page. If you have an idea for an episode, something you want Joey and I to discuss and take a look at, please drop us a line there. We'd love to get your feedback, or if there's anything else we can be improving on, you can use that form as well. So for the Offset Podcast, I'm Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Joey Diana. Thanks for listening.